right.
Did
She
Donald
fought
Trump
very hard.
change society, or is he just a reflection of it? That's
Hillary
actually
is
a
wor-
deep question. And like all deep questions, I'm not the first one to ask it. That question actually was asked and debated in the 19th century by Thomas Carlyle and Herbert Spencer. Thomas Carlyle advocated for what is now known as the big man theory of history. This is the idea that history is marked by the work of great men. Herbert Spencer, on the other hand, advocated for something that was quite the opposite. He saw great men as simply reflections of history, and he thought that, well, if you would get rid of one of these great men, someone else would come along and take its place, because society was the one that was generating them. So as you can imagine, Carlyle and Spencer could not agree on what theory defined history. But something that they could both agree on was on the fact that you could use biographies to understand history. Because after all, no matter whether great men shape history or whether they are a reflection of their society, they are the atoms that we could use to understand historical processes. The problem is that there's many people that have lived, there's many people that have contributed to our history, and understanding all of that data is kind of difficult. So maybe we could imagine that there could be a world in which there would be someone that would be able to read all history books of all biographies that have ever been written, and we could interview that person and ask them, well, what are your thoughts about history? How history changes over time? What are the eras that determine the breaks in history that we have? And so far, I don't know anyone that has that capacity except for one person. That person, that many of you might remember from the 1980s, was Johnny Five. Johnny Five was this very charismatic, very smart, very warm robot, that, among other things, had a big passion for books.
Input, 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 woo, woo!
And here you see what Johnny Five will do when he encounters a bookstore.
Input, Treasure Island, origin of the species, everything you always wanted to know about sex.
Five.
More.
Fabulous.
That's good. Oh, I like that one. That one too.
Boring. The movie was better.
These two are wonderful.
Five, what are you doing? You're gonna get us busted here.
Frederick, I must read these two books very carefully.
So now you can imagine, what if Johnny Five would not just have access to a bookstore, but would have access to the internet? Okay? What we could learn from Johnny Five. And one of the things that we've been doing in my group at MIT is actually developing a sort of Johnny Five that we didn't embody in some sort of metal can, but we embodied into computers that could go and read all of the biographies that exist in what is the many language editions of Wikipedia. And together with Christian Jara, Amy Yu, and Shahar Ronen, we've created like this very large data set of all of the biographies that have ever made it into more than now 15 language editions of the Wikipedia. And we know where these people were born, what professions they had, how famous they are, and at what year they were born. And this is Johnny Five's view of history. On the x-axis, you have a timeline going from the year 500 BC to year 2000. And on the y-axis, you have the number of globally famous people born in a year divided by the population of the world in that year. You can think of the y-axis as the probability that your son or daughter would grow up to be Michelangelo or Serena Williams or Madonna. Okay? And what the Johnny Five view of history tells us is that there was a period of 2,000 years that was marked by a constant number of globally famous people that we remember. So if we look at the number of globally famous people born in the year 300 BC or in the year 1200, and we divide it by the population of the world at that time, the number of people was the same. And what does that tell us? What does the constancy of that fraction tell us? Well, that was a time in which the bandwidth of history was very little because the technologies that we had to record events were very constrained. This was the writing era. This was an era in, if you had a book, it was probably because you borrowed it and you copied it yourself. And the bandwidth of history was so little that only few people were ever recorded. And the people that were recorded were actually biased towards institutional leaders. So if we look now not only at how many people remember from that era, but who these people were, we realize that these were mostly religious figures and political figures. But then, there is a break, And what we see is that the number of globally famous people that we remember after the year 1450 increases. It nearly doubles. And we have, what Johnny Five would call the first era of printing. So with the introduction of printing, we had a great revolution, in which not only the number of books that were produced increased drastically, but also, that revolution changed what these books were about. For the first time, scholars now could have access to dozens of books, and they could read all of these books to produce their own books, and mix their ideas, and they rediscovered, books from ancient Greece that finally, were now in print and were available massively. And with this introduction of printing now, history had a larger bandwidth. It could include more people, so it did not focus only on institutional elites. Now, at the margin of history, we had the emergence of the arts and the sciences. The people that now become globally famous in the years 1400 to 1700 also include painters, composers, mathematicians, and astronomers. But what is interesting about this is that there's also a second era of printing that starts in the 18th century when people discovered new printing formats. In the beginning, when the printing press was invented, most people were printing books. And books was what there was to print also before the invention of printing. But as printing became more ubiquitous, people started to discover new formats of printing like newspapers, journals, and pamphlets that did not discuss ancient events, but discussed events that were happening now. And in that context, you have the emergence of what people call the public sphere. Because I don't know if you guys know about this, but actually in the 1600s, coffee was illegal. And was illegal throughout most of Europe, and there were great movements of people that were advocating to legalize coffee. And one of the things that these people did is, write pamphlets and write magazines and write journals that would advocate, for the legalization of coffee, which eventually becomes legal, in the 18th century. And in that context of trying to figure out their own rules, and trying to provide literature that they could use to advocate for the rules that they needed to have, they developed this public sphere in which they eventually figured out that it was better for them to participate civically to create the rules than to be subject to the rules of the king. So before democracy could be installed in most countries of the world, actually people had to discover these forms of civic participation, and the second printing revolution is one of the technologies that helped contribute to the emergence of these new civic forms of participation. So who becomes famous in this second printing revolution? Scientists have a heyday, with the invention of journals and pamphlets and newspapers, physicists, chemists, mathematicians, but also artists like composers, painters, and writers also see their global fame increase. With printing, you have the rise not only of institutional elites, like you had in the era of writing, which was mostly oral culture, but of cultural elites. But of course, printing is not the last technology that has changed our society. What we have after, the beginning of the 20th century is the era of film and radio. And here you see the slope of the number of globally famous people that we're remembering increase drastically. So now who gets included in this era? And what the introduction of film and radio causes is a great shift on our collective memory of the arts. Remember that in the era of printing, the people who had become famous were the painters, they were the composers, they were the playwrights. With the introduction of film and radio, who becomes famous now is the performer. And you have a great shift in which now it's not the one who writes the movie, but the one who plays in the movie, the one who is remembered. It's not the one who composed the song, but the one who interprets it, who sings it in front of a crowd. And that's what we see in our data set as well. So you see that now the people that we remember from early 20th century involves a lot of actors, musicians, and singers. And finally, the last era that we can look at using biographical data is the era of television, which starts more or less in the middle of the 20th century. And the era of television also introduces a new type of cultural elite that also involve performers, but these are not performers of drama or comedy, but the performers of sports. Okay? So with the rise of television, you have the rise of the globally famous athlete. Why? Because television is a synchronous medium You know, so you don't go to the theater to watch a football game. You know, you watch it at home, and that football game is not that interesting the moment that it's over and the score is known. Yeah? So because of being a synchronous medium, it actually generates the rise of globally famous sportsmen, and you see that soccer players, tennis players, race car drivers, basketball drivers become globally famous with the rise of television. You know? So one thing we could ask Johnny Five, and please turn up the volume here.
If the medium is the message, and it doesn't matter what we say on TV, why are we all here tonight? And why am I asking this question?
So here you have Marshall McLuhan explaining the theory.
It didn't matter what you asked on TV. I said that the effect of TV, the message of TV, is quite independent of the program. That is, there is a huge technology involved in TV which surrounds you physically. And the effect of that huge service environment on you personally is vast. The effect of the program is incidental.
Please, would you show your
So that's Marshall McLuhan, you know, and Marshall McLuhan and Elizabeth Einstein were two scholars that actually had already anticipated this Johnny Five validated theory of history that we observe in our data. You know, they advocated for a theory in which communication technologies were the ones that shaped society. As Marshall McLuhan said, like what changed society is this vast service environment that surrounds you and affects you. The program is incidental, but the effect of the technology is the one that is transcendental. So we think about it, and we go to the beginning of our presentation, we might say ourselves, well, what are the lessons that we have to get here? And the first lesson is that the technologies that change society are those that change social interactions. Nowadays, you have lots of innovation. You might have innovation on towels that help you dry better. You know, you might have innovation on, you know, clothes that keep you warm during the winter and so forth. And all of those innovations are great. They make our lives more prosperous. They make our life easier and more comfortable. But in reality, the technologies that truly change society are the ones that change who we interact with. You know, who we talk with, who we remember, who gets amplified. Those are the ones that really rewire us and are the ones that have these transcendental long-term effects and are the ones that we can see in this historical data. And the second lesson is, well, you know, if you doubt about a recent presidential election and you have doubts about who might be running this country for the next few years, you can always count on Johnny Five.
Robotic citizen. By this ceremony, the United States government decrees that he shall have the same rights and privileges as any other citizen in this nation. My special congratulations to you, Mr. Johnny Five.
Five, tell us how you feel.
How do I feel? I feel alive!
Thank you.